And we're so glad you're here for these first of four conversations about race. Again, we're delighted you're here. We're going to be streaming this, but also recording this, and so this conversation will be available online for you to check in and send to friends who weren't able to be here with us. I want to give introductions to our guests. Dr. Rachel Snyder-Vlachos, who has her PhD from Rice University, and she is one of the two who have PhDs from Rice University. We've got a lot of Rice owls in the house. Cleve Tinsley IV is here. Dr. Cleve Tinsley IV is also here with us. They both work with Project Curate, and they're going to tell you a little bit more about Project Curate. But some of the genesis of this was Cleve and a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Matt Russell, dreaming up what this work would look like, and then developing it in such a way that it could not only bless the people and the church communities that they're related to, but in a broader context as well. And so I know they will share a little bit more about that journey. Another way that Cleve and I are connected, he is married to someone I went to seminary with, and Lanicia, I should have got a ticket for her as well, because she's an amazing artist who ministers through church in Houston, and so they're just a wonderful, very thoughtful pair, and so we're glad that Cleve is part of that pair is with us this morning. So really I'm going to turn it over to you guys and let you introduce your work and yourselves, and then have a bit of conversation.
Awesome.
Why don't you welcome them?
So I'll start by first saying thank you for having us, and my appreciation to you for self-selecting, for being willing to have these types of conversations, trying to marry our faith traditions and what it means to be a good person, a good human, a good Christian, with also what it means to live in a world where there are certain differences, cultural differences that exist, that we must try to merge with the base of who we are as moral beings. Rachel and I have a certain plan that we could have a conversation with, but this is your time, so we're in a rush to go anywhere. We'll leave as soon as you want us to, but what we want to do is let you know, first of all, that this is your time. We want to permit time for you to have any questions. We want to have a robust conversation with you around anything you want to talk about as it relates to this. I'll start by saying how this work for both myself and also for Dr. Rachel comes together is a struggle that we've had theoretically, but we also have been concerned as concerned citizens and persons of how to merge what we think about with how we live, right? It's one thing to study the relationship between religion and race as an academic enterprise. It's one thing to be involved in struggle for racial justice, or more broadly, struggles around human rights struggles, and then relate that to what that means for us to be persons who have a religious conscience, has a sense of moral compelling within us to move us. And so we'll talk more broadly first about our ministry at Project Curate, what we call our project, and then we'll talk more individually about us, but then we'll make sure we open it up to talk to you guys. We also decided in the beginning that before we moved to having a more narrow conversation about friendship, we had to first have a conversation about what solidarity is, and what having conversations about cultural differences. And you'll hear us kind of substitute cultural difference with race throughout our conversation, because race is only one of those cultural differences. And so with that, I'll yield to my colleague and let her talk more about Project Curate first and how we came together.
Yeah, thanks, Cleve. So Project Curate is a bit of an experiment that we have been on for the last several years, but really I've been involved with for the last year and a half. And basically it was born out of a sense that our church communities in particular often really struggle with how to have honest and deep and engaged conversations about race and about racial injustice and racial inequity. And we also recognize that very rarely do these conversations, when they do happen in a way where there's a real deep connection and conversation across racial difference. And so the vision of Project Curate is to really kind of make interventions in a number of different ways, but one of them being, let's have critical conversations about race and about racial inequity and about what it means to struggle for racial justice. And let's do it in a way that challenges some of our hierarchies that we've had, challenges some of the historic relationships of power that we've had. And we also we have a community engagement component of our work too. So many people who are part of our core team are very active in their own African American communities, also Latino communities, really working tirelessly on the issues that directly impact those who are most impacted by racial injustice. So that's a little bit about our work, and Cleve can say a little bit more about that, about how it came to be. But briefly speaking, like my own involvement with Project Curate really came as a result of a long journey that has been about me engaging with my own whiteness and my own white identity, and the fact that I grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical context, upper middle class, and I really wasn't given any tools or really a sense of resilience for conversations about race. I wasn't really taught to see race, and I certainly wasn't taught to discuss it. I really swam in a segregated and unequal environment by race, but I wasn't taught to think about that. And so I've been on a long journey to recognize that there are deep differences between my own experiences and the experiences of people of color. And not only that, but I was shielded in many ways from really confronting the realities of racial injustice in this country and thinking about how white people have perpetuated deep harm in relation to communities of color. And so that's been my process of really unpacking that and learning how to be comfortable pulling back the veil and really digging deeply into my own history, my own family's history, American history, and not just digging deeply, but learning to listen and see in a new way, learning to actually attend to the deep suffering and frankly terror that people of color have experienced in this country, and not turning away, and really sitting in that. And so we do that sometimes together, but I also think that it's not so much about kind of what is being done out there. There's still so much that can be done within traditionally white communities and white spaces, because we haven't yet wrestled with our own histories and identities and how those are very entangled with the suffering and oppression of others, both in the past and also in the present. So I struggle. I go to a predominantly white church, and we struggle to have conversations about, implicit bias, that we all have these deep ways that we've been conditioned to see ourselves as superior, as good, as moral, as worthy, and been conditioned, as particularly to see Black Americans as inferior, as dangerous, as threatening, as criminal, and that we don't even realize how much we've absorbed certain messages. And so it's a struggle to both recognize those messages, but then also to say it's not racism or white supremacy isn't something that is out there or that belongs to bad people. It's actually something that we've all participated in to the extent that we all live in a society where there is this hierarchy by race that puts whiteness at the top and puts blackness at the bottom, and then positions people somewhere in between that hierarchy. And it's very hard to go into any social space in this country and not see that hierarchy somehow operating. And so part of what we have to do is learn to recognize that hierarchy and say, is this really the path to collective human flourishing? And what other possibilities could be there for us if we allowed ourselves to challenge things that we have just taken for granted? And a part of the reason why we want to challenge it is because it really is tied to deep suffering. And it prevents other people from living into their full flourishing.
And so if you were to, just to give some more context, if you were to go to our website, projectcurate.org, you'll see that broadly we kind of construct ourselves and say we specialize in public engagement on issues around religion, race, and also what we call collaborative engagement around intersectional justice issues. All that really means for us is, as we began doing this work, and I'll back up and talk about that, we recognize that the key link or nexus between religion and race as categories is power, right? Hierarchy and power and how they get configured in different institutional spaces. And so our struggle was to try to create or belong or construct a community that at least provided room for the hierarchy to not so much infuse of how we have to operate. For instance, and as a back context, myself, I'm an ordained Baptist minister, grew up in the context for a while before I went to graduate school. And for me, I have a different experience. I'm not sure how many of you read one of the books we recommend by D.G. Hart on Trouble I've Seen. But in there, he gives a story about his racial upbringing as an African-American male. Mine was quite different from his. I was reared in an impoverished black neighborhood that was pretty segregated, socioeconomically speaking. And so I didn't have much interaction with whites until really after high school when I went to a predominantly white college. All that to say, for me, there's this instances he talks about not only racial stereotyping, but also this type of not really rationally based fear of sort of what it means to be black in certain spaces, but also the constructions of kind of what it means to exist in certain worlds. And so how it really came together in Houston was this. By the time I went to graduate school, I still was informed by certain questions. What does it mean for me to not just be a Christian, but what does it mean for me to be a black Christian, to exist in a place where it seems like my blackness supersedes even over all these other areas? Hart talks about this in his books, like, I was born into that same first naivete. I remember when I first professed Christianity in my early 20s, and I went into churches, and I just thought, oh man, this is it. Everybody's gonna love each other. This is gonna be community. It's just gonna be beautiful. Now, this was not a predominantly white church. This was a black church I'm talking about. I just knew, hey, finally, I was gonna be a part of a community where everybody loved each other. It's gonna be great. And I remember how heartbroken I was when the senior pastor walked by me the first time and didn't speak. I was like, oh man, that's messed up. We're supposed to be in this community. Not to mention sort of how those things factored outside of these contexts when I started interacting with other white Christians or others when I went away to seminary. But how we really came together was something happened. You may remember in 2016, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Dallas police officers got shot all around the same time during this 2-week period. And I had been heavily involved with work around the social movement, really, which is considered a new era of civil rights movement or human dignity struggle called Black Lives Matter. And we had been struggling in Houston community specifically. Matt had been working around issues of immigration, and they've been having these cohorts coming together. But this happened, and finally the city, much like maybe the same context with you all, whether it's around a statue or whatever, at some point there's a cultural touch point where change needs to happen. We need to have a more robust conversation. Even if we don't know how to do it, we need to bring people together. What happened was Matt was responsible with the Texas conference there of organizing, what they call a vigil. Persons come together, hold hands, pray, and let's move forward. And what happened is I was in graduate school, Matt was in this consultation this thing, and they called several African American ministers, United Methodist ministers, and some of them didn't want to touch the issue, like not because they were afraid to touch it, but because they were feeling certain things at a certain time. They didn't feel like they can be really addressed with integrity in this setting with a range of their peers and also in a range of this power structure and really say what probably needed to be said. At that time, I was viewed to be safer to kind of address these issues because why? I wasn't in the sort of nexus of power relationship, right? My career couldn't be altered that significantly by it. And so we had this vigil and we began having a harder conversation. We framed a theological conversation about toward solidarity over and against terms like reconciliation and saying, what does that really mean? And it was a bridging together of different types of critical conversation, different types of ideology, because out there in the community struggle, what's typically has happened, especially now, right, is we can't assume some of the same presuppositions exist. The key thing, whatever else you might think about this era of sort of movement struggle in African American communities regardless, is they're willing to now say, look, I don't necessarily have to share the same ideological perspective you do if it's gonna like quelch the sort of desire for us to recognize the common dignity of other folks who are different than you are. And so the challenge for me and Matt initially was, hey, how can we have these conversations with a theological basis in Christian churches or in conversation with other community folk who are not a part of your churches, in conversation with other persons who might be struggling for the LGBTQ community, in conversations with others who may not share the same type of ideological perspective you share. And how do we do so? How do we become comfortable having the very symbols that sort of uphold our power dynamics challenge themselves? We recognize the challenge in that because at the same time we had this curriculum that was theological in nature, but at the same time we were trying to attract other community members to come. And so what we did was create an alternative setting where persons just like yourself self-selected and decided to critically have their not their faith challenged, but put their faith in conversations with folk who challenge certain problems they may have had with the faith tradition. And how do we do so? How do we have conversations where a person may disagree with us on some of our philosophical presuppositions, right? But in the end, agree that we should value and esteem the basic dignity of life of every human being, right? In that, we can see God at work. And so that's how it kind of began. But it was a combination of things. Yeah, we got in rooms like this where we had conversation, but apart from that, Rachel was working with an organization there with whites. I was working with organizations in the community, engaged in other struggle, where the concern wasn't necessarily religion, but we just brought all these communities together to say, okay, if we want to think about religion, what does it have to do with all of this? Whether I'm Christian, Muslim, non-believer, atheist, humanist, or whatever, is there a common core we can have this conversation? So that's a broader context that we have as conversations. But then more narrowly, as it relates to our churches, what does our faith tradition, how does it really address these broader conversation and issues? Mm-hmm. So that's just as a background for kind of what we do in Project Curate. But here today, we try to address like, okay, what does it mean for us though, as those who are to be light bearers in this world, to address where cultural difference is not this problem I gotta just resolve, but maybe an opportunity for me to grow and have a richer conversation about who I am and even how I conceive of who I should be as a deeply moral Christian person.
And one thing I didn't say earlier, that part of my journey over the last several years is my PhD, I actually study South Africa. And I did my dissertation on progressive white Christians who were trying to begin to wrestle with what it means to engage the past, the racist past, and racial inequity in the present. And as many of you, or some of you may know, South Africa ended this system of apartheid in 1994. It was this legalized system of segregation, much like Jim Crow in the South, but it had a number of layers to it. And so the first time I went to South Africa was in 2002, and that was the first time I had to confront the fact that I was white, because I went into a context where there was still massive suffering and memory of the injustices that had occurred. And I realized it was easy to judge, but I realized actually the history of South Africa is almost identical to the history of the United States. And the horror that I was experiencing in this other place in relation to these other people, actually, it began to awaken to me to the horror of our own history of racial violence in this country. So that led me on this journey of, okay, I can't separate myself, I can't distance myself, even though I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and that my family doesn't have these deep, we don't talk about deep cultural or historical narratives that are connected to race. I'm still part of this broader culture, and certainly globally speaking, as a white American, I'm still part of a global system of power. And so I became really curious, because South Africa has had this massive transition of power in some ways, but in other ways they haven't. Like, what happens? Like, what do people do when they start to feel like things are shifting, when there starts to be challenge, like similar to the movements that we've been seeing in our own country, that there have been mass movements for justice? What do people do when they begin to feel uncomfortable in that challenge? And what I found in South Africa was that, for the most part, churches have become places where people have retreated. So churches have become the place where people go to feel secure and safe when they feel like out there's all this cultural change. And very few people are actively seeking to engage with social transformation. And if they are, they're not doing it within churches. And so I was really struck, though, by the few people that were involved, that they were forming these very experimental social and spiritual communities that were really taking them away from white spaces, the wealthy suburbs, the elite spaces, and that they were intentionally living and working in poor Black communities. Now, there's lots of problems that I talk about in my dissertation and challenges with this kind of movement, but there was something about shifting their relational environment and their social environment and putting themselves in a place that was deeply uncomfortable and unsettled them, that allowed for new possibilities to begin to emerge, and really critical conversations, sometimes for the first time, of having an equal who was a Black South African to speak back to them, that the first time ever having a conversation with someone who they weren't in an unequal labor relationship with, that someone who wasn't their gardener or their maid or the person who looked after their children. There was an opportunity to have a whole different kind of awareness about the real suffering and inequality that is still existing in South Africa. So all that to say, when I came back in 2014 from doing a year of research, I felt like I can't, again, it's easy to pick apart all these things that other people are doing and all the problems, but I felt like I can't just stay in my head. I actually have to get messy myself. And I came back to a country where people were dying and where this has always been happening, but we had really in a deep and visceral way this whole period of awakening in our country to police violence, to the ways in which people experience, people of color in this country experience a sense of fear and a sense of constraint. And so that began my own activism work about, okay, how do we awaken, or how do I help awaken myself and also fellow white community members to both educate them, but also to mobilize and say, how can we be in solidarity? How can we shift away from the places we've been comfortable and secure and move towards a posture that is willing to be unsettled and is willing to take risks for the sake of justice and for the sake of solidarity. And so that's really ultimately where I then became involved with Cleave.
Yeah. And we want to move, I guess, more to Rubber Hidden Road, because a lot of the stuff we're talking about now, right, is easily accessible through not only recommended readings, but basically just a Google search, right? You don't have to do much research to find that there's deep inequality in our education system as it relates to sort of our prison systems, as it relates to housing. There are various ways in which race matters for the life options of folks of color, right? That's easy to kind of go. But what really shifted for me, I think on a more personal level, is, as I told you previously, I hadn't had many sort of what I call really sincere, sustained engagement with whites over my life until really I became in this justice work, and just so these incidents forced Matt and I to consider what would it mean for us to join together. Part of me had something at stake. The integrity of who I was as a person allowed me to gain a certain trust in my community, which meant, like, for the most part, Cleve ain't gonna just be aligning with anybody, right? And so, along with what would it mean for me to say, hey, I want to not only work with Matt, but then also, typically what happens, and we're gonna address this, especially amongst well-meaning whites, is this, what this means is always on a personal level. Well, if we can just be friends, right? Or it means if I can just, and also times what I would get is like, what friendship meant was like, hey, Cleve, can we go have coffee, right? A lot of progressive whites in Houston did this to me. If you're seeing this, apologies, whatever. But they invite me out to coffee. Great. We go sit down, have coffee for an hour or so, boom. That was it, right? That was the real work of bridge building that needed to happen, right? And so when Matt first approached me about joining together in this sort of deep set of like, he also would use this word of like, hey man, more than that, I'm just interested in becoming friend. And I fundamentally challenged that and said, I don't think you really understand what that really means, right? Because in my experience and what I've seen is that in most of these interracial or sort of different type of relationships, I've always seen, at least in my experience, not saying this exists across the board because I know other folk that it doesn't exist this way, but what I've always seen is that somebody, usually the person of color, is sacrificing part of themselves to really be called your friend. There are many folks who I know who are saying they got white friends when really the same white friend doesn't really value the relationship in the same way. For instance, right, and I named some instances. Is it gonna be harder for you to be my friend if when you do something that really a lot of black folk have problems with, but they don't say anything? Would you be able to sort of handle that? And so we formed a whole semester in our cohort about, these deep type of personal interactive type acts. No, it's not okay, right? Even though you may think it's okay, it's not okay for you to always go up to or ask a black person, man, your hair is really interesting, or I just gotta touch this, right? These type of microaggressive acts happen all the time. But are you able to handle being in a context where that is not only addressed and spoken to, but however that person feels like addressing and speaking to that, and are you able to handle it? Because we all have these sort of deeply implicit unconscious biases on how we feel about certain things. And our own sort of ego exhibition sometimes don't like being able to handle that. What does it mean for me to be in a relationship with a woman, and the different factors of how my own gender kind of configures power dynamics I need to check, right? And so we realized if we really were gonna do this work together, one, we had to mean what we were gonna say. My caution to Matt was, look, you don't have to call me your friend unless we're really there. I'm not interested in just having labels. I'm totally okay with us saying, hey, we joined together as a coalition to do this work. That's much easier because that way people don't get hurt by these labels that sometimes we loosely throw around. We especially have to be careful of that as Christians because we always throw that out, right? My brother, my sister, we're family, we're all in this together. And we even can have a conversation sitting next to each other in a setting where we feel that's supposed to happen. But we go to coffee shops and we act like each other don't exist. And so part of our challenge was, let's create an environment where sincerity is possible. Let's not lean into anything that we don't really mean. And I think what you'll find is you're not only freer to be who you are, but you also will find real relationships forming out of that sincerity and that genuineness. Because my challenge to him at first was like, look, before we can even have conversations about friend, I got to be able to ask you a couple of questions that I've heard, I don't know you, but I want to ask you these questions. And he was willing to hear those questions, right? And as we started thinking about doing a curriculum together, we said, hey, we're not going to create this space where what often happens, what we do in our churches, we elide difficult issues, right? Folks of color are often taught implicitly to overlook subtle offenses that other folk don't have to overlook, right? So little slips like, oh, that's good. Or power taps or calling somebody a boy. How do you address these little interpersonal interactions that we don't recognize continues to sustain and support ideas and notions of white supremacy? And so that's what we're going to kind of get into a little bit about today is, what does it mean for me to say, no, I really view this person who is different than I am as my equal? What does that mean for you intellectually, morally, and sort of in my daily interaction with them? Another thing we often saw, what I often see actually amongst a lot of evangelical churches, for instance, is the idea of really getting to know my neighbor. That's another term we throw out. We should be friends with our neighbors. We should go to our neighbors who are less fortunate to us. Let's go to the margins. I began challenging a lot of this language that exists amongst my friends because I said, you do realize these tropes still situate folks as being less than you, right? There are ways that we even read the basic gospels that don't really disrupt the notion of superiority we might have, whether it's along lines of socioeconomic status or whatever. Every time we cast and say, it's our job to go to our neighbors or to go to the margins, what are we still? We're still saying, look, they're less than us. We're just going to go to be with them to make ourselves feel better. And so these are things that in the midst of our curriculum and cohort we try to do, not just in theory, but in practice, we try to disrupt, right? Because the truth of the matter is, like, no, I don't want anybody to come to think they're trying to help me. No, I don't need you to help me in that way, right? Create an environment of equity that exists there where we can both exist in this same space. And what I typically do, and a lot of our friends is, and what's the challenge is where I think is helpful is, what happens when persons who typically never experience any type of interaction or exchange outside of the normal environments they would go in, are able to have conversations with folk who won't let them get away with some of the subtleties of what it means of being this in a particular space, get away with, right? And so these are some of the challenges that we think about and we want to kind of talk about on a more personal level today. What does it mean for me to say no? I not only think it's our job to challenge racial hierarchy, what does that mean for you personally in your life, right? Because I think the first step for everybody, including myself and everybody, is let's be honest about what our ends are. What are our real goals? Do we really want to change the way we live personally? Or are we just saying, look, things just need to be better because I'm tired of what I'm seeing on television? And so with that, I kind of want to not only yield, but also hear more about your own experiences and kind of what challenges when it comes to this stuff is most meaningful to you. What would you like to see? What vision that you've heard from Reverend Coleman and other, or what's going on in this community, what kind of challenges does it bring about for you? How do you see race working in your everyday interactions and experiences? That's what I'm really interested in hearing, because I think then we really can get at some real issues that may not just come up naturally.
So I think what I'd like you to do is to think about some questions. Creighton, maybe if we could grab a microphone here and be prepared for folks in the congregation to ask some questions. I'll ask one as we're transitioning into that. So, Cleve, you mentioned this moment in Houston where there's this prayer vigil and people from different traditions, white churches, black churches gathered together, and I know some of the people who are in that room. There's a pastor of a church very similar to ours that brought certain of his folks, and he texted me on his way home and said, "I have to talk to you." And so we got on the phone. And he said, I don't know what the heck just happened, but I got people already angry at me. because they thought they were going to come into a space to pray about some things that were hurtful in the community in such a way that they would be soothed to then leave that space liberated from their sense of frustration and guilt and all that kind of thing. And so what he dealt with, and I would argue still dealing with, is trying to develop the capacities in the midst of his congregation to even have these kinds of conversations, even begin to think about the friendships and the conversations that you're talking about. And so what's a way that a congregation or a congregational leader like me can begin to facilitate some of that in their local community?
First, like what I always say first, especially what I always say to ministers that I know, especially, I say, first of all, look, it's difficult. One, like to have really meaningful conversations about race first requires something like what's happened here. Persons self-selecting and saying these conversations are needful to happen. And then when you create the space, establishing what I call this basis for having it, right? I asked Justin earlier, we were sitting at the table, what are some of like reference points in our narrative tradition that kind of elicit these conversations? What did cultural difference look like in the biblical record, whether it was Jews and Gentiles, whether it was Samaritans and how persons are described? I mean, this stuff is not devoid of racial realities, right? They had to deal with it. Sometimes we just don't necessarily talk about it. But I think what begins to happen is persons being able to have a space that's kind of open and honest and people don't feel ashamed of saying what they feel. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we recognized was, hey, we got to create a space where along this line of spectrum, whether it's black and white, you got a whole bunch of people described as brown, yellow, and in between, where folks are able to really say what they feel without feeling like they're in a place of censure for how they feel, but also recognize that how they feel is not necessarily going to be pacified, but also may be challenged, but also you're not going to be criticized by how you feel, if that makes sense, right? So it's okay for a white person to say to me, look, I feel frustrated, right? If that person is willing to also hear, right, reasons why their frustration might be valid or invalid to the person that they may be expressing it to, right? So for church leaders, I think it's important. And I also like say the difficulty is that, Sunday mornings may not necessarily be the context for it. But I think the series that's starting to happen, hopefully what can happen is like there are broader conversations about this, right? Where somebody comes in and does it. But then leaving this context, I think members might be like saying, hey, there were some points raised. Can we have a focus group where we start thinking about this or delve around this and how Scripture addresses this or how our tradition addresses this or how our community addresses this? There can be other focus groups to where it won't be everybody's issue in the congregation, but time where a focus group decides, you know what, we've been exploring and having these conversations about it, but what would it mean for us to engage in these conversations with so-and-so's congregation? And if our comfort expands more, what would it look like to us engage in a conversation with why are university students pushing this way, right? So I just think it starts with what you're doing today. Like, believe it or not, a lot of churches won't do this for various reasons. So I think, in short, I want to say you're already starting it, but I also admit that it's complex too. It's very complex because how do we live into this universal narrative we have that we all belong together? It's all about God and unity, and what they want to happen at that vigil, for instance, was just to have, hey, let's pray about what we agree on, hold hands, and let's bridge peace. But what we refused to do as a community of color coming in was allow you to skip over the real issue. So what they were upset about was this. The template had changed for them. I came in expecting this. What I was not coming in was hear a conversation where my theologians were not cited, but I started that conversation talking about other folk, whether it was James Cone, whether it was Keller Brown Douglas, or other folk who lifted from particular cultural experiences and how they affect how persons read Scripture. Part of our ritual performances during that time, instead of us doing typical rituals that we may do in the church, we did a ritual where we lit candles specifically to those who had been slain. And we intentionally named the folk of color and did not name, in particular, the Dallas police officers, right? All those moves were intentional. It was a disruption of what typically takes place and who is typically centered in these spaces, mostly predominantly white spaces. But you can't say you're ready to like really engage this work if you're not willing to do two things, especially when you have power. One, be willing to have your power disrupted in ways that may be uncomfortable to you, but then also be opening to hearing alternative perspectives that you may not have heard before, but then learning why those perspectives are not non-normative, but why they have been labeled as such.
So I really enjoy what you've said there, and I would encourage everyone who's here today to begin to think about some of those points of tension and resonance that you think that we might have some focus groups and some conversations about, and please message me about those, and also be thinking about some of those communities that we might connect with in our broader community, the church and other institutions, to have some meaningful conversations. And I know a few of you already have some ideas about that, so please email those to me. We want to follow up on those. So questions that any of you have. I'm giving you a moment to think about them. Any questions that you want to ask Cleve and Rachel, or me for that matter?
And please don't be shy to come in. This may be your one voice with every, really, this is not a space where there's a wrong question at all. There is no stupid question. There's no overly aggressive question. We've heard it all, I promise you. Okay.
Hold on just one second. Do we have the handhelds on?
Is that one working?
Give us just a moment, because I want these questions to be captured well on our recording.
Testing. There we go.
Thank you, Josh.
What,
Yes.
give her that one, Creighton. You've got it.
There we go. Boom.
Okay. Oh, amazing. When Justin preached about this topic 3 or 4 weeks ago now, I was particularly struck when Justin, you talked about, and I think I shared this with you, the experience of being white, being, you said, a thing. It means something. It's specific. And so I've thought about that a lot since then. Okay, until I can appreciate what it is in my life, it's how my life has been affected by being white, just inherently, despite anything I may or may not have done. So I guess my question is, to me that feels like a tough road to really get into that, because it upsets a lot of our assumptions about how we've worked for what we have, or et cetera, et cetera. So I'm interested in how you actually encourage, empower, challenge people who are white to do that, since most of us in here are white and we have good intentions. So that's my question.
Great question.
So I would say that I think sometimes that there is a lot of fear among white people to even begin to open up this box, because to like come to terms with yourself as white, there's a Christian ethicist who writes, it is a kind of moral crisis. It can feel like that, and spiritual crisis, because I think the sense of goodness and maybe even like divine blessing in terms of like the narrative of like what it means to be white in this country begins to be challenged and disturbed. And so that process can be quite painful, there is a need, and I would encourage white people to practice leaning into discomfort and knowing that discomfort is not necessarily the road to death, but the path to life. Because, I mean, if you think about, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of Jesus and the narratives of exorcism in the New Testament. You know, the process of actually, if you think of this as a sickness or something that is a kind of evil that we've all collectively absorbed in terms of white supremacy and racial oppression and violence, which is so counter to our deepest ideals of every person being created in the image of God. If you think about that as like a sickness or a sin or even something demonic, that process of being freed from that is not necessarily a comfortable one. There's a lot of resistance. And yet, that is the path to life and to healing and to community flourishing. And so I can't sort of I can't promise that there's not going to be pain, because the pain has already been borne by others for so long. And so it's time to take some of that pain onto ourselves and to sit in that. At the same time, what gives me hope and what I would encourage other white people and white churches and what I have found in my own life is that in that discomfort and that painful process of learning to hear other narratives and other histories and other experiences, my life has also been deeply, deeply enriched. And it's been enriched because I don't feel paralyzed anymore by the fear or the guilt and the shame, because I'm actually making a lived commitment to work for repair, to work for justice. I'm actually now involved with work that is about making amends. It's not about me being a savior or a benefactor. It's about me realizing that actually other communities have wisdom, and they actually have ways that they have survived, ways that they have thrived, that they can teach me. And so that's been like very liberating in itself for me to realize that actually I am gaining through the process of reevaluating my sense of self. And so that's been really important. And I would just encourage, there's like the hope that there can actually, in the process of making amends and repair and centering justice, that we can actually find our own humanity that has been destroyed and distorted by this thing called whiteness and white supremacy. And not only that, but we can see and recognize the humanity of others. Yeah.
If I could like one word for friendship for me means vulnerability, right? And so what deep, meaningful friendships do, and something Rachel and I think we alluded to, but we didn't say explicitly, is there's about a core on our leadership team of about 13 to 14, 15 people now, and we're not just committed to struggling together for whatever ends of justice, whatever that looks like, but we're also committed to being in deep community and friendship, which is what this subject is about. And one thing friendship does is, one, it's a room of vulnerability and trust that has to not only be established, but constantly sustained, so it never ends. For me to be on stage with Rachel or Matt or anybody else is also for me to have a type of not only solidarity, but a commitment to Rachel and Matt and everybody else in ways that has to be thick and robust for me. And part of it just has to do with my own constitution, because of how I came up. I don't believe in half allegiances, but then two, it has to do with, vulnerability means I have room and Rachel have room to recognize that we're fallible human beings, right? But too often or not, that level of trust and vulnerability has to be something that's grown to. It doesn't just automatically happen. You just can't. And what oftentimes we saw when we started this project, for instance, a lot of folks would automatically belabor folks of color with, look, I need you to teach me or to be open to all my questions as I'm trying to figure this out. Help me, right? And what folks don't realize is that, no, you're asking this person to take on a burden of helping you figure it out while you constantly subject them to a type of violence that they should not be experiencing, especially for somebody who's not really close to them. They have to experience that. It's one thing, right, if Rachel makes a mistake, but I know Rachel, right? And we have sustained relationship to each other, and there's time for us to address that. It's one thing for me to show up in a good faith effort to try to be a part of a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural community, experience violence, and then leave that space. And so the difficult conversations I have with churches and church leaders all the time is, one, you need to establish what you mean by what you want. There's a difference between diversity and inclusion, right? Diversity means I want different representations that I look at. Inclusion is, no, I want to make sure that everything from my curriculum to my ritual to whatever I do includes a multivariate perspective that forces everybody to live into a multicultural environment. That's different. And my argument is also is like, I'm not necessarily arguing that all churches should strive for that, given their traditional formations. I'm just saying we should be honest about what we're trying to do in our context, right? Because it's okay if you say, I want diversity, and I also want us to be able to address these issues because they're important, right? But living into inclusivity requires a different level of vulnerability and trust that is the kind of constitutes what real friendship is. Because friendship means, as a life partnership, is like, hey, this person, no matter what, I'm committed to them, right? I'm going to do the tough work of working through this with them. But Rachel and Matt can do that with me in ways that they're the only two that can do with me, right? Like, I'm not going to do that with everybody who happens to be identified as white who wants to come to me and do it with, right? So I just kind of want to add this as well, is like, yes, it's difficult work, but part of that difficult work involves, I would argue, whites first being able to say, hey, this is not only something that is important, it's important to me, and I need to figure out how to do this right? And because I don't know how to do it right, doesn't mean I have the excuse to just stay ignorant and say, oh, well, just tolerate with me. No, just like all of us are expected to get on Google and learn our own about stuff that we really are interested in, we learn about it, right? We also can figure out ways to enter into these things in meaningful ways. And then what'll happen is when you connect with these kind of communities, you'll learn that there are things. For instance, we offer a curriculum now called Whiteness 101, which is about this, that we learned the hard way, though. Because at first, we just started by throwing everybody in one community, Justin. And like, while it was fun for me, it wasn't, and for some of us, we left every week like, oh my God. In fact, we couldn't do anything the rest of the day because we didn't know what we were trying to do. And we recognized that there were different needs in this community, right? For the folks of color, they were trying to like justify not only their existence, but their need for stuff. For the whites, they were like, but hold on, y'all not really getting us. We're the good people, aren't we here? Right? And so we recognize that, hold on, there's some other stuff that needs to kind of happen here. Different affinity groups, but also just like you're saying, I want to learn about this. And so all I have to say is it just starts by conscious group of folk coming together saying we want to address it first. And then you'll figure it out. It may look different than how we do it, but it starts by like what you're doing today. It's saying, hey, at least I know it's a need that needs to be addressed. And two, I know it's something that doesn't need to be glossed over just by some superficial language that we use, right? But I need to really get into the thick of these issues.
Right. I'll just add one more thing to what's been said. We talk about resilience as it relates to this kind of conversation, and I think an aspect of resilience is the ability to carry the normative pain of the disorientation and reorientation as you discover what it means to be white. So in the Coleman household, Chaka and I talk about every week, multiple times a week, for the entirety of our relationship, certain pain points for being African American in majority white communities. It's been multiple times a week we have a conversation about this. It's a normative pain that we carry. It's a normative pain that we carried before we were married. I can't remember not carrying this thing of constant disorientation, reorientation, trying to understand. And so there's a certain belief that you could go through a short period of that and then be okay. I actually think it's the ability to carry this normatively. And I was in South Africa in 2000, and as a person in my 20s trying to have a conversation, I was there for about a week and a half. I was in a conversation with a black person in South Africa, and I made a reference to my own blackness, and he stopped me very sternly, and he said, "You are not black." This is the first time this has ever happened in my life, someone to say this to me. And I said, "I don't understand." He said, "You're colored." Because there's black, there's colored, and there's white here. So for a week and a half, I carried the pain of relocating myself in this space, and it was traumatic for me. I mean, I was with a church group, a multicultural church group, and for the next several days, I just was processing this to try to understand myself in relationship to this new social strata that I was part of, got thrown into, didn't have a choice in it. It just, and the differentiating factor, if you don't know, is they were able to say that given my appearance, there has been I have some white ancestry, no matter how it's gotten, in my DNA. And so for them, it's often the pain of a white person having slept with a black person, often against their will, which creates a population, a segment of society that's known as colored. We have similar dynamics here. I mean, that's my family story. But just to find myself in it in a different way was painful, and it meant a lot just to be able to carry that pain and not let it go. And it helped me to connect with whites, coloreds, and blacks in the midst of that journey with them over that just week and a half.
Something you said is really important, which is like sharing your own experience of just the daily or weekly kind of normative sense of what it, like the pain of white supremacy and racial injustice in this country and how it intimately impacts you. And I think that has been, the more that I become aligned and aware of different experiences and take on some of the pain of how it impacts people I care about now. It's not divorced, it's not someone out there, it's people that I'm intimately close with has impacted me in a new way. But also the pain of like all the ways that I was socialized and conditioned growing up, like what that did for me to not be given a real sense of history, a real sense of human suffering. I'm still working through that, but I think now there's like a sense of shared pain. And that is also can be a really powerful thing in terms of both shared vulnerability, shared risk-taking, and shared pain that I think calls us to work towards a different kind of community. And whether we have all these big systems, but we also are all these big systems are made up by small systems. And so if we can enact change and we can hold the pain together, we can begin to work for another possibility, even in our most intimate relationships.
Other questions? Yeah.
It's getting recorded. You may want to hear me.
Yes.
Don't know. Something you said about vulnerability and connection to friendship. Earlier this year, or maybe late last year, online on a Facebook page that I'm in, I made a comment about some group of people and thought nothing of the way I had worded it. And someone of color who is a friend called me on it about the phrasing and what I'd said and how it hit him and other people. And initially, my reaction, if we'd been face to face, I would have been going, but Archie, I didn't mean it that way.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to hurt anybody. But I read it and I thought, he's right. That's because I don't see it that way. And I went in and removed my comment so as not to perpetuate the hurt. But it was out of friendship that I was able to be called on that.
Yeah.
That he felt that he could correct me. Don't know if he would have corrected any, another 100 people, or whether he would have just let it go and thought, I'm not going to challenge her, I'm not going to change that person. I think he knew he could say honestly what he thought to me. And after the fact, it was an honor.
Yeah.
But the vulnerability and the friendship is what's important, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, it's biblical, right? I mean, the wounds of a friend are faithful, right? These are things that are not foreign, especially and part of my hope, especially for, and I say this, my especially hope for Christian communities is none of this stuff is foreign to the ethic of who we are as people. I mean, if nobody else should be able to forge community, it should be folks who, for the most part, intuitively do this every week and whether it's through Bible studies, through Sundays. I mean, we know about community. So what are some of the challenges that we just need to fix about ourselves? And so yeah, I mean, it was great that he had the moral courage as the friend to kind of went and do that. The challenge becomes how do I create these relationships? Especially, how do I create these relationships where I really value and esteem that in somebody? And I make a person feel like they have that space with me to do it. But I want to make sure we get a question there too.
So, in my own journey, I grew up here in Chapel Hill. And I was also a graduate of Carolina in the early 70s. And it has really struck me in the last couple of years. I've just left the university running the visitor center. And so race has been a huge part of discussions, presentations. And so here I am, old, white, and a woman running this visitor center with a whole crew of incredible students. I staff the office very much for diversity of thought, opinion, every way that you can think about it. Because I wanted it to represent the university as I saw it. The reality and what happened through my tenure there was that what I gained being in that relatively small, very intimate environment with so many different kinds of backgrounds and thought and students and age in all those ways. But I was really struck in this last year that truly I considered myself a thoughtful person, an educated person, somebody that wanted to be in the world. And truthfully, right this second, I don't know what that tipping point was, but it was that idea that in all my education and discussions, no one had ever challenged or asked me to think about me being white. Oh, I thought about being a woman, thought about my age, a lot of different, a Southerner, a lot of characteristics, but not being white. And so that has led me to study that it's another culture. But we're not ever brought up to say there's a culture here, culture is everyone else. whites. It's not the white culture. So once, I mean, truly it was astounding. It has been fascinating. It has been painful. But, you know, we go to Europe and we want to know all about what French people are going to be like. We go all different places, yet it's someone else's culture. It's the African American culture. We have classes on that, but we don't explore ourselves as the white culture. And I think it is exactly what I have come to understand. It is nobody's responsibility but mine to know what that means and how I have fit in, accepted, didn't think about myself as in the rest of the world. And that's part of it, I think, is what you've been saying, Rachel, that you come up with these, oh my gosh, I didn't mean this. I didn't, how could I have said that? How could I not have known that? But I would certainly say that it is enlightening. It has made me more faithful. Because that's what awareness and education do. When you can feel more yourself and in your own skin, then you can feel and react and be that friend or feel that pain. And so I would only encourage all of us, I think you to follow your curriculum. I was looking through it, and we've already watched some of Ugly Delicious. I didn't even know it. I called my daughter, and she's like, what do you mean you don't know about that show, Mom? But we've had discussions just seeing 2 episodes, and and there's another book that I had found in my travels called Waking Up White. And so that, I carried it around like embarrassed in the beginning. And then it was like my jaw dropped open and I had to talk to everybody. So it, you know, became the office conversation. Oh, what's Missy gonna ask us about today? So anyway, I just wanna offer that, and I'm so proud of what you are doing, that you have invited us in to have these discussions, and that we get to live in a place and a town and a church like this.
Yeah.
So
Thank you for that. A little funny story about this book, Waking Up White. A few of us on clergy staff had it, and I had it sitting on top of my desk, and somebody walked in and pointed at it and said, you've been here too long. That you feel like you've woken up white. So one of the things that I end up being interested in is boundaries. So boundaries in relationship and friendship, as you're talking about race, it's sometimes hard for me to understand or know what's an uncomfortable boundary that I've just crossed. And so we talk about it in interracial friendship, romantic relationships fit that. I've had, this is kind of a long way around to a simple question. I'll get to the question. I've had some of my most interesting conversations about interracial relationship actually here in this congregation. 3 moments as an associate pastor really stand out, and they're various. One, we had a professor in our congregation that teaches a freshman class, large class, and so she brought about 100, 150 of her students over to talk about race and friendship here in the sanctuary. And so I gave what I thought at the time was a pretty stellar lecture. And so this impetuous kid sitting in the crowd says, yeah, that's fine. But you mentioned that you've just had your first son. Our son Zan was less than a year old at the time. And he said, would all this hold up if Zan tries to marry a white girl? And he thought this was a dividing line, that this was going to override the entirety of my 45-minute brilliance that I just shared with him. And he was just sure it was going to derail it. And I said, no. And part of that is just, who I am and even my network of relationships. So that stuck out to me, that this student thought, being classmates, being coworkers, being friends that spend time together works, but there is a line that can't be crossed. Another conversation with some parents who had a child who was interracial relationship, and this is actually one of the best, most honest conversations about this that I've had, and I still love and respect these parents for coming in and having that conversation with me, because it was really honest and beautiful. That represented what I thought was a good, honest conversation among friends who were wrestling with something that was very important. However, as a counterpoint to that, in the very same year, there's a couple college students who were in my office, interracial couple, and asked what I thought about it. It just really wanted my blessing. I said, look, y'all are great. You're being smart about relationships, loving, have fun, but not too much fun, and be about, your merry way. Well, this person's parent called our then senior pastor and said, I've always taught my children to treat one another as equals, to respect one another, to be fair, to develop friendships. And clearly we were wrong, because we never expected this to happen. And at the end of the day, whites are superior to blacks, and told my then senior pastor that she needed to correct that black associate of yours and let him know how this should work. Well, my then senior pastor, in her very pastoral way, said, heck no, you're wrong. And she'd known these folks from another church and said, I can't believe you've actually sat under my teaching as a pastor for so long and still held this. It was actually, I just thought, good job. That was Ruth. Maybe you know Ruth. Good job, Ruth. But it struck me that there are dividing lines here that and it's hard to tell where they are. And so when you come into that moment of tension where all of a sudden it gets a little bit too personal, unexpectedly, a landmine is there. How would you suggest us as a people of faith engaging it? Because we don't always know. In the instance of that last person, that parent did not know where that line was for them. They didn't expect it even themselves, but when it was crossed, boy, did they act out. And so how do we, even ones who aren't aware of where those boundaries are for us, how do we engage that when we are viscerally struck and say, no, I don't want to go there?
I'm just trying to.
He's just wondering how close it is to 3 at this point.
No, not really. I'm having a good time. I'm just always aware consciously of how I am as a person, and then try to balance that against the real sort of disorientation it may cause for others. So for me, I just fundamentally believe that you should not articulate something you have not deliberately thought through yet, right? So for me, it's like, don't say I'm race conscious and it doesn't matter for me, and I really think this should be a world of racial justice, and this applies across the realms, and then you get to that dividing line and realize that's not what you really think, right? So for me, I just think it involves, at that moment where I says, you know what, I have a race consciousness now, I need to do some internal work on what that means for me, and do the hard work of recognizing where the difficulties that may lie. So for me, I'll be honest with you, I was on the opposite side of it, right? Never having this multi-ethnic experience, growing up in this sort of rich and impoverished type of quote-unquote black environment, meaning stereotypically black, right? Where the questions of sort of moral ethics were a bit more grayer than black and white, right? And so this created in me a type of critical consciousness as it relates to religion already, right? Yes, I hear you, minister, always telling me and my friends to pull our pants up or to not wear this bandana or whatever, right? However, when I think about the folks who are really with me when stuff goes down in life, these are folk I can count on and folks who I can't, right? So for me, it was the opposite side. I grew up really inherently not trusting whiteness in a way that some of my colleagues may have, right? Yet, at the same time, I was open because all along the way there were amazing white persons who were there at critical junctures in my life, in high school, in college, even now on my advisory committee for one of my dissertation. Like, there's junctures that happen. And so for me, I had to ask a question. So there was a time where I was more on the sort of pro-black side. Look, no, I ain't never marrying white, would never consider it. My child ain't never, my grandchild, nobody marrying white, right? But then you had, as I started engaging myself, started critically examining what all this difference means. I think about, no, if it works the opposite way, it has to work other ways for me. No, if a person fundamentally falls in love with who they fall in love with, or if this stuff works and I believe it's possible, then no, none of that can matter for me. So what I think especially for us as Christians, for instance, like, is love at the center of who we define God to be in the beginning, right? What are some of the ways that we see these lines challenged when Peter was praying and said, I don't want to be with this, and the challenge by the Spirit to say, no, this is not unclean, right? So what areas in our life that we have to fundamentally challenge these barriers we have in our mind and ask ourselves, what has conditioned that for us? What has conditioned me to think that this is less than? What has conditioned me to think that if my child marries somebody outside of their race, they're fundamentally messing up, right? Now, this does not mean that I'm able to totally bracket off and say, oh, well, I'm considering the sort of social disadvantages this may create for my grandchild. Okay, great. Just recognize when you're using that as an excuse versus then really considering, what are some conversations or what are some different ways persons have to address that in their relationship? And so I just would say we just have to make certain moral, ethical decisions about what do we feel our sense of call to God really calling us toward as it relates to human relationality. Are all persons equal in God's sight to me or not? Right? And don't say that it is if it's not really the case, because the truth of the matter is, the real challenge for that person is not fundamentally, I don't really believe all people are equal in God's sight, right? And so the question is a theological and ethical one for that person, right? We just have to and so I'm all about people standing in where they really are in life. Don't come into spaces claiming one thing that's not how you really are. Do that work and be a person of integrity, right? Be able to say, look, you know what? I believe this, but this is not what I believe. And pass those values on, but don't, because what happens is you're going to have this moral crisis that comes about. There's no way for me now, even somebody who wasn't thinking how complex and sort of the complexity of sort of web of race issues happen. At first it was just about blackness for me, because partly I was blinded by my gender and my sort of cis normativity. I'm a straight black man, it's about race, it's about being hard and a black man in America. But until I got involved in this, when you start engaging in this struggle, you realize it's much more complex to that, right? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be this? There's a whole bunch of difference that's calibrated along this. And I can't fundamentally say I'm really for any type of justice if I'm not for that justice for everybody, right? We just have this hierarchy and this white supremacy that really kind of funnels and kind of configures all this stuff and how it works out. But at bottom, I just think we should be people, if no other persons, who are able to kind of work through what does it mean, this difference. And I think it requires responsibility of our pastors. I commend Justin and others who are able to wrestle with these deep issues. But what I think the problem is in a lot of our churches is we just don't grapple with these rough issues enough.
And I would say with the boundary issue, one of the things that I think is important if you're thinking about, okay, what would it mean to build interracial friendships or relationships? And I won't even say friendships, because I think relationships, let's begin there, because it's taken me a long time and to think about, I've had really important, particularly Black mentors in my life who've really helped me on this journey and have really been key sources of truth, speaking truth that has really challenged me, sharing experiences that have really transformed me, and also really encouraging me even when I was making all sorts of mistakes, because they saw that I was sincere as much as I could be sincere. But those relationships, even in that, I felt and sensed that friendship wasn't something that was cheap and that I would have to earn through a long process of showing up and continuing to show that I could be consistent, that I wasn't just dabbling in this because, it was a showing of consistency over time. And I think trust needs to be built over time, and it won't be quick. And that's okay, but friendship is really something that I think requires, it's a gift. It's not a right. It's not an expectation. I can't say I want to be friends with Cleve. It really has to be something that comes about through shared time together, the building of trust, the having hard conversations, the increased vulnerability. And then that's when you begin to hit those issues. I mean, we were talking about it beforehand. So one of the things that as our friendship has grown and our relationship as colleagues is that even now I can be I'm so sensitive because I'm still learning, okay, what are the things, like in terms of the people that I care about, what is going to be offensive to them, what is going to have an impact. It doesn't matter my intent, but if sometimes I can, just show up in a space and not think about it and talk too long, talk first, interrupt, those kinds of things. And so as I'm thinking about it, I can tend to be very conscious of the mistakes I'm making. Okay, but sometimes that can be a barrier to our relationship if I'm constantly needing my guilt to be heard or constantly needing some kind of affirmation instead of trusting that there's space in our relationship to make mistakes. But not everyone is Cleve, right? So it's a matter of feeling out every relationship and understanding that each person is going to, but creating a space of hopefully, I don't want to say safety, but of courage, that you can feel like your relationship can hold those hard and difficult conversations. And then for me, that means when someone tells me that I have caused harm, it's showing a commitment to hold that, to not shield myself from that, but to take responsibility for that as best I can. But it's also not wallowing in it.
So we have a chance for maybe another quick question or two before we close. Question and quick answers. So, yes, go ahead.
That's okay. Mine's not a quick question, so that's fine.
Are you sure? All right.
Well, I was just going to, let me just say real quick. I'll try to make it quick. I hate to look at people's backs of their heads, but I came in and sat on the back row back there. But Justin, when you made the comment about the interracial marriage,
you hold the microphone up a little bit.
When you made the comment about the interracial marriage, I had to kind of, I wanted to kind of give my experience on that, and then y'all followed through on it, which is great. I had just a different reaction from the one couple and the one gentleman. My daughter did a very beautiful thing. It's been 15 years ago, so this has kind of been my journey. She fell in love with a young Black gentleman. And, it just kind of came on. And then the next thing, and she, we met him quite a bit and kind of had him in our life and everything. And then he calls up one evening and says, "Can I come over and speak to you and your wife?" And I said, "Yeah." And he comes over very formally, very politely, very nicely, and ask us for his hand in marriage with our daughter. And so that really, my reaction at the time was, I've thought about these other things. It's the grandchildren, and I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old right now. And so that was one of my thoughts. And my other thought was, I can remember a friend of mine, I was at a Durham Bulls game a few years ago, and he saw a young black gentleman and a white girl walk by on the concourse. And this was a guy that I'd grown up with years ago, but I don't see him about maybe every couple of years. And I saw him at the Durham Bulls game. And he just made a comment, and he said, "That just ain't right." And I'm sitting there like, and this is when my daughter was already dating this other gentleman. So I thought, whoa, you know, this is I'm kind of getting in the middle of a lot of this, you know, but I'm not going to be in the middle of it. And what I found was just the opposite. I had said many times that our children, thank goodness that my wife and I, particularly me, I kind of stayed out of the way in raising our kids from the standpoint that I wanted them to find their own experiences. I felt like there's going, you know, that I'm only so good myself, so I hope they find a way to be better than I am, not just maybe that I can instill in them how good I am. And my kids from very early on, I said, we're colorblind. My daughter's birthdays would be like the kids of the UN, United Nations delegation. You know, there'd be somebody from every race and every country at our birthday party. And then one time my son came home from preschool, and he wasn't but about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, and he was telling me about this kid that he played with that day and the stuff they'd been doing and all, and I thought, you know, I can't quite place that kid. And I said, tell me something about him. And I finally just asked him, is he black or white? And he looks at me like, I don't know. and really and truly, that was not something my kids, and I thought, and so this reinforced it when my daughter all of a sudden is marrying a black gentleman. And I said, hey, this is not a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to me. It may have been a little bit of a surprise, but I thought, this is how she was raised, you know? And so I said, that's the culmination maybe to tell me that, you know, this skin color is just not important. I mean, we've got to get past this. So I've been on a journey for 15 years now myself to try to get to a point. But I will tell you, buying the 2 books that Justin recommended that we buy, I'm still here. I bought both of them Friday night. This one I finished by this morning before I came to church. And I've already, and I showed Justin after the service today, I've already written notes in it, I've highlighted it. And I actually wrote this, I got into the first chapter and said, I need to go ahead and make these comments. Because usually I don't mark up a book, but I said, I need to mark this book up. Because this is telling me more and getting me quickly in a place to where I wasn't sure I could get. And then hearing the other things today, and I think these other sessions are going to be great for that, but I would highly recommend.
And which of the 2 books is that you read?
This I'm still here, Austin Channing Brown.
Yeah.
Now, the other one I'm going to read too. I just didn't get both of them read by today in 2 days, but anyway, I did really good to read one in 2 days. So I immediately made myself the notes. I flipped back after the first chapter I'd read, and I got my highlighter out, I got my pen, I said, I'm going to start marking this book up. And so I wrote on the first page, and this is my granddaughter's name, and it may be years before she reads this or looks at this, but I'm getting to that point in my life, yeah, I'm getting old too, I think. I just recognized that the last couple of years. Always before, all the people around me and my classmates were getting old, but I wasn't. And I said, you know, how come they're getting old? But anyway, and I dated it and everything, and so I wrote this. Maya, I'm studying this through church so that I can be the best grandpa to you and Zachary. Zachary is my 1-year-old grandchild. And treat you as you deserve and nurture you. I will do all I can to help the world around you support and nurture you. I see in so many ways that your church, anyway, there's another, they go to another church a block up the road, University Baptist, Mitch Simpson, who many of you may know, and I know Justin knows and all. And I just see how well they fit in there, and I know how they treat them, and I let that be their church so that they kind of, you know, I don't get in the way of it. I said, you have the greatest parents, my beloved daughter Michelle and my loved Ricky, who are providing a loving environment for your continued development into the beautiful girl and soul that I have the joy and God's blessings to enjoy. With all my love, Grandpa. And so I've gone through this thing and just written different things in here and said, hey, you know, how about this? You know, what if everybody, and I said this several years ago, I said, you know, as we move more toward what I thought at the time, when all of a sudden we had President Obama, and I said, the timing of this is perfect. It's right as my daughter, my granddaughter is seeing a black president. She's coming into a world that she sees her dad's black and her mom's white and the president's black. So she very quickly, by the time she was just barely speaking, every time she saw a U.S. flag, it'd be bomber flag. She still calls it the bomber flag, I mean, to this day. And it's just very important to her. And, but I had seen, and I thought, at some point, if there's enough interracial marriage and enough assimilation of all the different cultures, like we did that from the people that came in from Europe, you know, you do the DNA stuff now and you're part 5 different nationalities from Europe. But if at some point we didn't see the differences in people, then as I put in here, all of a sudden, everybody should be able to accept everybody because you don't know which they are, you know, how they're different from you. So anyway, but I do just highly recommend this, and this has moved me to a point that I've been very critical of white racist and all the stuff that's going on. I mean, man, I'm just outspoken on it. I'd go berserk on some of that stuff. But I've realized, wait a minute, I need to look at myself too, because I've grown up in a way that I certainly have certain ways of looking at things that could be that influence and that white racism also. And so that's really changed me. But,
yeah, thank you for that.
Anyway,
Thank you for sharing. And we've got to close ourselves down here. I mean, we're at our time. So could I say this? And we've got a couple other folks who have burning questions. Would it be okay if we extended 10 more minutes, heard both questions back to back, and then offered, if you two would offer us summation or closing comments based on those 2 questions? So a question there and then a question here.
Mine isn't a question, it's a comment.
Yeah.
Justin and I happened to be placed next to each other recently at a wedding reception. And it was wonderful. And we started talking about cooking. And he and Chocolate share the cooking. And I said, what I did when I cooked for my family, and I felt kind of out of it because I'm just a single person now. And I said, did you ever try Julia Childs, which is more my time? And I said, what about the new pressure cooker? Have you tried that? And it's the whole thing of the commonality. We weren't real common because my kids are older than he is, but I think we need to look more at that. How are we alike? What do we share? We share the love of a family, we share concerns about this child not eating, that child eating, and so forth. And I think that's my comment.
Thank you. It was a lovely wedding and a lovely conversation we had. Let's question here, and then y'all can offer us final comment.
Peace to everyone. I want to make 2 positive comments about the Methodist Church. It's not so much a question. I'm a guest of your fair city, hosted by our son-in-law and our daughter. They're trying to convince us to come here to North Carolina and Chapel Hills in particular. And so one of the methods...
And I predict that'll be everyone else's conversation with you as we close.
So needless to say that everything is going in the favor of us moving here. But 2 positive comments. In the early history with John Wesley, in the founding of the first church here in America, the first membership included a black slave, female. I used to remember her name. The other thing, I was sitting in the library, we got here a little early, and I looked in a book called Wesley and the People Called Methodists. And John Wesley, he was very sick. He would write in his diary on a regular basis, and he was getting very, where he couldn't write or he couldn't do too much. But he did write his last note in his diary, and he wrote it to, he commented that he wrote a letter to William Wilberforce. And William Wilberforce and others in that time were doing quite a lot about slavery. So I would encourage you to look in the library and look for this book, Wesley and the People Called Methodists. I thought I wrote the page number down here, but just look in the back, you'll find 2 references for slavery, and one of them mentions what he wrote to William Wilberforce. I thank you for this event. We were looking forward to coming to it. Hope you do it again. Peace to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, Rachel Cleve, what would you say to us in closing?
I would just encourage you all to continue this path. It's really, really important. And as Cleve said in the beginning, many churches wouldn't even be beginning to have this conversation, let alone say we want to have it. You've been very courageous even to step into the discomfort that maybe even this conversation provoked. And really, it's a journey. And so I would say be generous with one another. Also own your, we say this in the group I'm part of, Showing Up for Racial Justice, own your impact. So recognize that like my behavior and actions have an impact on others, and I'm open, learning how to even more so through our relationship be open, and other relationships to be open to that impact, and really sitting with that. And yet, I think if there is any community that is equipped to be generous and gracious in that process of transformation, it's a church community. And I think that can be the real power of engaging in difficult and hard conversation, but even more so, the hard work of transformation.
I would only add, I would just like to say, thank you for the setting and for having us. Thank you, Reverend Justin and this congregation, for just being willing to sit in the space and have a conversation. It's very hard to do without automatically sliding into what I call different identity allegiances, whether it's United Methodist, Baptist, Black, white, or whatever. Identity politics, I don't think is a negative thing, but I do think it is a thing that sometimes that can prevent us from having what I call constructive, deconstructive conversations. And the only thing I have not said in this setting is that I think my own perspective has always been one of like being able to question why have such hard lines, and what does it really mean for whatever I cherish as a tradition, if it's stifling me from being able to see the dignity of another human, why is it very important for me to uphold and maintain that, right? And what I see is across identity traditions, religious or otherwise, is that there are ways for you to still create a lively, robust meaning within whatever tradition. Yes, it may be a bit different than how most folks status quo look around you, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find that you'll connect to these traditions, somebody in your tradition who likewise was not satisfied with status quo and with people being excluded within a community that should be included. And so I just say keep on wrestling with that, knowing that you don't have to be perfect in it. Don't lead over it for the whites. Don't ever go, I don't believe in white guilt. I hate that, so like don't be too guilty, but also own up to who you are, right? And own up to the ways that differences can make us better and not shun those differences. That's it.
Well, thank you to Rachel and Cleve for being here. I hope that you will pray for them and their work with Project Curate. I know they'll be praying for us. We're going to adjourn to the parlor where we might want to have some other conversations there for a few minutes. I thank you for being here today. I hope you'll come again next week and these next few weeks as we have these important conversations. May we go in peace.